author, columnist, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com, talk show host, and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, as always, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we are talking the economy. Zohran Mamdani, Joe Rogan, and the K-shaped economy, and much more. It's quite the in-depth show coming up. Please remember, Liberty Nation Radio, sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Hello and welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we're joined today by Liberty Nation's Economics Affairs Editor, the economics guru, the man who knows perhaps even more than Jerome Powell himself. Take that in any way you wish, Andrew. Andrew Moran, thanks for being here, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, we decided to do an economics special today, and I wanted to kick this off with what I consider, it's a bit more political than economics, but Zohran Mamdani, when he won the election day and he gave his victory speech, and he said these words, Andrew, and I'm sure you've thought of it. For our radio listeners, Andrew's shaking his head with a wry grin on his face because he knows exactly what this quote is. And we will, quote, "We will prove that there is no problem too large for a government to solve, and no concern too small for it to care about." Now, Andrew, we're both with Liberty Nation, whose parent company is One Generation Away, and obviously based on the quote by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan had another quote, didn't he? There's the scariest words in the English language, that I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And so how do we split this particular ideological atom where you have Mamdani on the one side saying that there's no problem too small for government to care about, which to me, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, it seems to me that he wants to get government involved in every level of your life. Whereas Ronald Reagan, for his flaws, I mean, machine guns, come on. But
deficit.
And the deficit, had the idea that the government shouldn't be involved in your life at every single level. And those are two very opposing views. So, Andrew, first off, give me your thoughts on what Mamdani was saying there.
Well, not nauseating. I watched that thing. I was up all night covering the election. I saw that speech, and that was the main event of the night. And I just wanted to throw up listening to that and watching that. But it's not surprising. I mean, people, from a lot of post-election coverage I've seen, people are surprised by what Mamdani said and that whole, I think, because it sounded like he just did a regime change and he overthrew the government and the mask came off. But it's not surprising. If you look at his campaign, all of his campaign promises, it was promising absolutely everything: free buses, free childcare, free 2S LGBTQIP plus, whatever the case it was, city-owned grocery stores. He offered everything under the sun, and that's at a local level. So, if he's the face of the Democratic Party, which a lot of people say now perhaps he is, then that's going to go gradually to a national level. So that's what's concerning. But at the same time, I agree with what George Will said. He was on, I think it was on Bill Maher, and he said that every 25 years or so, there needs to be some election, city, state, whatever the case, where they introduce some socialist policies to show the young generation that socialism never works. So perhaps, New York City, a lot of stuff is not going to be implemented anyway, but if it were, it's going to fail, and that's going to at least hope to show the young generation of voters, a lot of young people who really were voting for Mamdani, to say, okay, well, these ideas aren't necessarily great. But then maybe there will be the opposite. Maybe they'll say, well, that's not real socialism. Socialism has never been implemented.
Yeah. I've not heard that from George Will. But it does remind me of something that Konstantin Kisin of Trigonometry said recently, that we only really learn from history. We only really learn from the history that impacted our grandparents, if that, or worse to that effect, because your parents tell you, well, this is what it was like in this day, and your grandparents, if you're lucky enough to have them around as you're forming your ideas, this is something that they can teach you. But it seems that this cycle's speeding up, and I think, I mean, this is an entirely different topic, but I think it's more to do with we tend to see we talk a lot about the nuclear family, but it seems to me that that has become the maximum rather than the minimum suitable standard for raising a family, unfortunately. But will they pass on the knowledge that, you know, socialism was this great evil that led to communism, that led to obviously the place that communism always leads, which is mass graves. So there is something interesting about it, though, because you'd expect New Yorkers that they're Americans, of course, and then they have this, the whole ethos of America is rugged, as far as I can tell. It's rugged individualism. It's what made America what it is today, which is the world's most powerful country and economy. And yet you have, in New York, you have this little pocket of humanity that has decided, let's not go for that. Let's go for the government can determine every aspect of my life. Because I think what people don't understand is that when it says the government, when Mamdani says that, you know, there's no problem too small, that means things that maybe you don't want them involved in. You know, why should the government be involved in, you know, how you educate your children, for example, which is, for me, one of the chief concerns about where I live, that someday like state schooling will become mandatory, and then I'll just have to move and take the kids somewhere where it's not. So why do you think they've opted for this switch around from what many of us outside of America or non-Americans think is the defining characteristic of America?
Well, first, I would say that New York City has generally pretty been left leading for the last 30 years. So Mamdani being elected isn't necessarily surprising. But now, to the broader question, there's this crossover appeal between the brand of Trumponomics and Zoran Mamdani. And it's this populist appeal. I mean, from Mamdani, he tapped into that for a lot of young people. And we tend to make fun of young people and their socialism, the love of Che Guevara that cost $200 to buy those T-shirts. But a lot of young people, especially in today's economy, they try to do the right thing. They go to college, they try to get a degree, they work a minimum wage job, but they can't seem to get ahead. I saw this recent study that came out and it said that the median age for first-time home buyers is 40. 40 years ago, that number was 27, 28 years old. So a lot of people, they feel left behind by this very system. So if it is a system of individualism and free market capitalism, and they see a guy saying, we're going to tear down this wall, we're going to, take, a hammer and sickle to it, then they're going to be attracted to that. They're going to find, okay, fine, maybe I can finally get ahead, or at the very least, burn down a system that I cannot even take advantage of. So I think that's why a lot of young people voted for Mamdani, and you can see that with Trump. A lot of young people voted for Trump because he wanted to dismantle the whole globalist system and bring back manufacturing jobs, and offer people what their grandparents had in the 1950s. Wearing the overalls and the steel lunch pail and going to the local factory, working 9 to 5, and able to have a job and a home and a car in the driveway and have some money left over. So that's what. So for the Trump voters, that's what they liked, and for Mamdani voters, the idea of cheaper groceries at a government grocery store, that's what appealed to them.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It strikes me as very strange that we have so many examples of how this kind of socialism has utterly failed in so many ways. So I mean, a lot of people quote there's the Northern Scandinavian countries and they're socialist, but even their leaders will say we're not socialist. We
exactly
have safety nets. They'll say we're not socialist. This doesn't happen without a free market economy. The kind of safety nets that people want doesn't happen without a free market economy.
Exactly. Absolutely. That's the thing, too. Bernie Sanders, he'll keep saying, we need to be more like Sweden. We got to be like Scandinavia. But the problem is that they're capitalist societies, but they have massive tax rates. They take from the productive members of society, tax them 55%, and then pay for these welfare systems. And a lot of them, so Sweden is not a great example anymore because of that whole migration problem they had and transform the education. Sweden used to be such a high standard for education in the world, and now it's slowly deteriorating because of their immigration policies, which of course is another issue for another day. But that taps into also the discussion of socialism and capitalism, and the high tax rates that you have to fund these types of programs.
Absolutely right. Well, we're going to be back with Andrew Moran talking about what's happening in the broader economy after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Andrew back on Liberty Nation Radio, continuing our conversation with me, your host, Mark Angelides, and Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor. Andrew, thanks for sticking around. Now, we briefly touched on why Zoran Mamdani was quite popular amongst the young. Quite popular, very popular amongst the young in New York. And part of that was because they either can't see themselves owning a home, which, as you mentioned, it's now at the average age for owning a home now is 40 years old. And that brings us quite nicely into now. It was only recently that I learned this, but this brings into 10-year yields. And for those of you who aren't familiar with why this matters, Andrew, how do 10-year yields impact the mortgage markets?
Well, the 30-year mortgage, it tends to track the 10-year yield as the benchmark, typically because companies rely on this because families tend to sell their homes around the 10-year mark. So the mortgage lenders, they base their 30-year yields on 30-year mortgage rate on the 10-year yield. And now with the falling 10-year yield, you're also seeing falling mortgage rates across the board. And you haven't seen these mortgage rates in about probably a year. And a lot of the consensus is that they're going to keep falling because of the lower treasury yields across the board.
So they're at the treasury yields are they're under 4% now. Is that right?
The 10-year yield, it recently fell below 4%. It's now hovering around that area. And it's completely fascinating because, at the start of the year, it was at nearly 5% and then actually, tanked to as low as where it is today. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, long-term government global bond yields have actually risen. So the Japanese bonds, the British bonds in your country, those yields have been rising. So it's been the exact opposite. And I've been amazed by what's happening in this corner of the financial markets.
So what's driving this decrease in the bonds?
Okay, so various factors. One is that the markets have been penciling in the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates. The Federal Reserve pretty much. I mean, Jerome Powell said that a December rate cut is not guaranteed, but overall the expectation is that interest rates will be falling.
So just to interrupt, way to go, Jerome Powell, for creating stability by saying it might happen, it might not, it might not.
It's so funny because he keeps saying that, they go on a meeting by meeting basis. And then he starts off this press conference by saying, it's not a foregone conclusion that maybe your interest rate cut in December.
Sorry. So, yeah. So carry on with what you're saying.
Anyway, so the next part also is that people have concerns about the broader economy. So when people have concerns about the economy or the financial markets, which is heavily dominated by AI, people will seek shelter in a traditional safe haven asset like the 10-year yield. So those are their two main factors why yields have been falling. The other factor could be that people have more confidence in the fiscal situation in Washington right now, that there's going to be a more sustainable path. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he had that 3 arrows growth plan, and he wants to have the deficit GDP ratio at around 3% by the end of Trump's term. Now, in the last fiscal year, they did make some gains on that because it fell below 6%. So his argument is that when the economy is not in a recession, or there's not a pandemic, or there's no war, your deficit GDP ratio should be lower. So in the last fiscal year, it came to 5.9%, down from 6.5%. So you're gradually making gains, hopefully as the years go by.
So do we expect to see a boom in home buying now that the mortgage rates are at a pretty recent low?
Well, that is an interesting question because there was recent data from Redfin. It's a real estate platform, and it said that there's more sellers than buyers right now. There's about 500,000 more sellers than there are buyers. But what you're not seeing so much demand from first-time home buyers or people trying to purchase a new home. What you're seeing is refinancing demand. I did a story the other day, and it was data from the Mortgage Bankers Association, and that organization found there's actually a 111, more than 100% increase in refinancing demand over the past year on a year-over-year basis because people were taking advantage of that lower interest rate on their mortgages. Because a year ago it was at 7%, and now it's at 6.2%. So you're potentially saving tens of thousands of dollars by refinancing. So that's the bigger thing right now. Whether I think if it goes below 6% or 5%, then perhaps you could see a boom in real estate buying. But then that creates the other effect whereby you're having a greater supply of buyers, but then you're not having a greater increase in supply. So that could potentially bid up prices, and you're back to where you were in the first place. But but for the most part, lower interest rates, that's something that Trump, he promised he would do, and that's something he's slowly delivering on. So kudos to him on that front.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted issue, isn't it? So you've got basic interest rates, you've got mortgage rates. I wonder if part of that equation, and I'm guessing it's going to be quite a small percentage now, but with there's the deportation extravaganza and the self-deportations as well. Now, this will affect more the rental market. But if the rental market prices drop, people have more money to put away for a deposit.
Yes.
And so do we see if what's the right way to phrase this? If the deportations continue apace as they are now, will we expect that to impact the first-time buyers market down the line?
Yeah, I would tend to agree, yes, but that takes time. I mean, I had a conversation with
down the line. That's what down the line means, Andrew.
Yeah, because I've spoken to many conservatives, and they say, "Oh, well, you're starting to see the immigration data influence the housing market," but it's too early to determine that even the data itself. I mean, it shows a steady increase in median home prices, and you have that stark decline in deportations. So you don't see a link yet, but perhaps in the future you will. I think one thing, I don't know if you're talking about this, but Trump had a proposal over the weekend by offering 50-year mortgages in a 30-year. I don't know if you've seen that, but that thing caused such a social media stir.
So I'm not entirely sure of the rationale behind that, and we don't have time to go into it in this segment, but do look out on the pages of libertynation.com for Andrew's coverage on that topic, because it's going to be quite fascinating. But just to kind of wrap this up then, so actually one quick question on the 50-year mortgages. So will it create an incentive for people to stay locked in at a specific house because other people might be doing the same thing?
I think it would all depend on the mortgage rate itself, because in economics, there's something called the lock-in effect. So you saw this in the aftermath of the pandemic when people got 2% or 3% mortgage rates over a 30-year span. They didn't want to they didn't want to sell their home because they got such a lovely 3% mortgage. So if I were to sell my house and move and get a different mortgage, I'm going to pay a higher price, not only for the price tag of the home, but a higher mortgage cost. So over that 50-year span, it all depends on the mortgage rate, but you can also refinance. So there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages over that 50-year mortgage. The primary disadvantage, of course, they're paying more interest to the bank over half a century. Your whole life, you're paying the bank for this property.
It's like a contract for immortality. We earn your soul in this life and the next. We're going to be back with Andrew after this short break, talking Joe Rogan's folly. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's economics guru, Andrew Moran. Now, Andrew, I hinted at the end of the last segment there about the Joe Rogan folly. Now, cards on the table, I'm a big fan. Joe, please do get Graham Hancock back on again, because my favorite guest. But he was doing an episode with Brett Weinstein, also a great guest on the show. And Joe Rogan popped up with, if everybody had, I think this is roughly how it went, if everybody had $500,000 a year in like a UBI, basically, a universal basic income, everything would be much better, because, crime would drop and people wouldn't have to worry about things. And I was thinking, well, sure, who doesn't want $500,000 a year just handed to them? But of course, that's quite the rabbit hole, isn't it? In terms of what impact that has on the value of your money. And there's no better person to speak to this about than an economist. Andrew, let's give me the second order effects here.
Well, I too like Joe Rogan. I like his podcast very much. I love that long form content. It's
Mm.
great. Dives into people's opinions. And if I would bring back any guests, it would be that Quentin Tarantino, Roger Avery filmmakers. That was
I enjoyed that one.
interview.
I
That was
enjoyed
really
that one. Yeah.
it's good. I like how they talk about Eyes Wide Shut and the story behind that.
Mm.
Yeah, anyway, so okay, so to your question,
Yeah.
I mean that I think it's a horrible idea to give everyone $500,000 a year. I mean, for one, where are you gonna get this money from? You're gonna print money, you're gonna run deficits. So I don't know how you're gonna cover this tab.
Well,
$500,000 a
he
year.
mentioned that though, right? He said that the AI drive will create such an economic engine and growth that it would presumably that would just come in from tax revenue, right, and then be redistributed.
Well, yeah. Well, I've seen an idea too. I remember, I think it was Bill Gates at the start. Oh, this was before AI was going through a boom, and he said that for every company that would have a robot, you would apply payroll taxes to each individual robot to help to keep covering the same tax base that the United States runs. But overall, I mean, it's still inflationary because you have to, because it's the government distributing this wealth, correct? It's not, Amazon doing it. It's not Amazon handing out $100,000 paycheck. The second issue, even if you want to remove that part of the equation, what you're going to have, you have another price inflation effect because you're bidding up the prices by having artificial demand. If everyone's getting $500,000 a year for nothing, they're going to bid up prices. But then that creates the other effect too, whereby maybe it's a moral discussion, a philosophical discussion, but when everyone's giving something for nothing, especially that level of money, $500,000 a year, and let's assume nothing changes in the economy. There isn't inflation, there isn't, labor shortages, everything is just right now $500,000 a year, you're going to have that same impact that you did during the pandemic. When people have nothing to do, their lives have very little meaning, and they dive into all these other things. I remember seeing a chart where the number of people who said they were different genders spiked during the pandemic because they had more time to just think. Speaking of Joe Rogan had a guest on a show. She was a psychologist, and she was saying, when you keep thinking about your problems in your head, you keep talking about it, you're going to be a depressed person. Whereby if you're doing something with your life, if you're working, having family, working on your hobbies, whatever the case, you're going to be a much happier person. Now, if people have all this free time, and they're getting $500,000 a year, who knows that they're going to be doing it? They're going to be allocating that time very well. So $500,000 a year for nothing, that creates inflation, that creates economic headwinds, and it creates also a philosophical dissection of humanity.
So you're not for it then?
Absolutely not.
So,
but there was a discussion in economics. They have for many years in Austrian economics anyway. Actually, I think even Milton Friedman talked about it from the Chicago school perspective, and they're saying how jobism, jobs is not necessarily the long-term goal for an economy. It should be wealth. So Elon Musk, he was talking on stage the other day, and he was saying how if you have robots and you have AI, that's going to create obscene amounts of wealth, and you're going to abolish poverty, and people won't have to work as much because the robots are creating all this wealth for you. And and what's wealth? How do you define wealth? Are you defining wealth by just having more leisure time and spending less time working? Are you generating wealth by having more goods and services at a cheaper cost? So there's a lot of discussion there, but overall, I see the point that they're making. But so wealth is the objective, not necessarily jobs.
Yeah, there's a few ways to look at this, I think. And one thing that I'm almost certain of. Oh, by the way, back to your point, I think clinically, neuroticism and depression are basically indistinguishable. I think that's about right. But I think one of the third, fourth, fifth order effects of such a plan, and of course UBI is not just something that Joe Rogan talks about on his podcast. There's been many implementations of it during for trials and tests across the world, and I guess what they've all reported is people felt happier to have a little more money in their pockets, but it didn't make them any more creative. It didn't make them any more driven to do anything. But I think what you'd find is the initial effects of that income coming in is we would see massive, what people term deaths of despair. You'd end up with people they don't have, because work kind of keeps you grounded, speaking to other people, having to think, having to put on your sane face for the day to deal with other people. It keeps you grounded, but then if you're taking that away. And for a lot of people now, sure, a lot of people have families as well, so it'll be different for that. Although I wonder how many divorces would take place once people are under each other's feet all day, because neither of them has to go to work. But you've got no goals in life. You've got no direction, no purpose. You don't have to keep your sane face on all the time. And what you might end up with is just a massive increase in deaths of despair, right? Because what else are you going to do besides, take your drink and do your drugs, because you've got the money for it. Why not? And people will have a great time for a very short time before that spirals. And I think that would be one of the immediate negative effects. Another one being that we would lose jobs from the economy that are only suitable for human beings. Because I'm sure AI and robotics and general technology can increase things to a level where we can take a lot of service sector jobs out of there. Food service ones as well. We see that. Well, I don't go to these places, but I look through the windows of a McDonald's when I'm going past, and they've got these machines where you go and order your food at a machine. So you're not dealing with it, and you pay there at the machine. And then presumably there's somebody at the counter who hands you your food. I mean, how difficult is it to remove that person out of the job equation, right? With robotics, very easy. But there are jobs that do require human touch. So, for example, we've all dealt with calls or typing, trying to solve something on the computer, and you end up you're talking to a chatbot, and it's this circular. My goodness, what's the right way to say it? It's Dante's ninth circle of hell, but you've got your heating on. It's it's the worst place to be. But then, so we know how that is. We've all experienced that, and that will improve, of course. But what about if somebody wants to sell you something, and it's something you might want, because people do sales and people do buy things? Are people ever going to accept being sold to by a robot? What about psychiatry? What about doctors? Do people want a human touch from a doctor? I think they probably do. Do they definitely want a human touch from a psychiatry or a counselor? I think they probably do, don't they?
Well, don't get me started on psychiatry. That's I'm not going to dive into that. But I think it all depends on the results base. I mean, if studies keep showing how let's say a surgeon, it's a robot doing the surgery,
Sure.
and this robot has 100% success rate and can do 24 hours a day, then people are going to be more open to that. So I don't know.
But
yes.
What about the nursing aftercare? What about the person who looks after you to come? You need somebody to move your pillow because your back's off. I mean, for many people, especially older people, if they're not living near family, or maybe they don't have family, that personal touch is the thing that keeps them alive. That's what nurses do.
I won't dispute that at all. But if robots can do the exact same job, and we all governments have budget constraints, and healthcare is a huge sum of money for all government. Up here in Canada, it's 50%. In Ontario, all dedicated to health.
You should look to someone from England with the national health albatross around the taxpayer's neck. Ever increasing funds, ever decreasing quality.
So one thing government wants to do up here is they want to have more at-home care, but that costs money. You need labor to do that. So in the next 50 years, 60 years, if you're having robots able to do that, they can actually provide 24-hour-a-day care, and they're more lifelike and human, and they're kinder, and you can program to be, more.
I dispute the word that they're kinder. I dispute that.
Okay, but I've dealt with many nurses over the last few years, and a lot of them are just jerks. They're not. I mean, I get it. They're overworked. They're doing 36-hour shifts.
They got to deal with people like you. I guess.
But if robots can do this, and they're more efficient at it, and it's cheaper for government run healthcare, all these things, then I would see people more open to it than the human touch, as you call it.
Okay, well, coming back to wrap this thing up in a messiest bow we can possibly imagine. we generally think that $500,000 a year or any UBI is probably a bad idea just for the human condition, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many economic discussions against it. I mean, there's so much, even the data, even these studies that have been done, they prove exactly everything that you've talked about. You know, like the drugs and the lottery tickets and the smoking. A lot of those studies show that more people spend more of that free money on those things, and of course, those things are not good for you. So UBI is a disaster waiting to happen, but it's gonna be inevitable. I have no doubt it's gonna be incrementally introduced across the United States and much of the developed world in like the next 20 years.
Well, we'll see what happens with that. And we're going to be back with Andrew after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Andrew back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain Mark Angelides, continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation's economics guru, Andrew Moran. Andrew, I want to talk to you about the K-shaped economy. And for those who are not fortunate enough to know what a K-shaped economy is, much like myself circa an hour ago, could you give us the brief overview there?
Okay, so the K is everywhere. If you go to business media, if you talk to economists, they're all talking about the letter K. Now the K, so the upper wing of the K, the upper arm of the K means that the high income people are doing very well in the economy. They're contributing to the economy. They're keeping it afloat. But the bottom arm of that K are the low and middle income people who are not doing as well. They're not spending. They're not earning more. They're struggling to stay afloat. So that is the K shape that a lot of economists, market watchers, and I guess inevitably the policymakers are going to be discussing in the next couple of months. So heading in 2026, the midterms.
Sure. So we see this. It's a tale of two trajectories, right? There's one
tale of two cities.
I know where I was getting it from. It was my quote. So you've got these two trajectories, and I wonder if there's any possible way that these reconverge, bar an economic collapse.
No, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, there are many things that the current administration is doing to support, the working class. So one data point that came out this past summer was blue collar wage growth. So the first 9 months or 8 months of the administration, blue collar growth was the strongest it's ever been since the Nixon administration. So that's one advantage to them. The other advantage are lower interest rates. If borrowing costs are lower for low and middle income people, whether it's credit cards, mortgages, auto loans, that's going to prop them up as well. But whether they reconverge or not, I mean, I think what you just said is probably accurate. You probably have to have a reset of economic conditions. Jerome Powell, he was asked about this during the latest press conference in October, and they're saying, are you worried about this K-shape that's forming across the economy and the marketplace? And his argument was that, well, not really, because a lot of the spending that's going on, particularly in the high income demographic, is fueled by stock market gains. And as you know, the stock market, despite that springtime volatility caused by tariffs, stocks are at record highs.
Yeah.
So people are making a lot of money on those stocks, and that's supporting, whether it's 401ks, individual stocks, ETFs, that's supporting a lot of consumption that's going on.
So I think what you're saying, that the ideal economic situation now after these divergent courses being plotted would be that the upper arm continues on an upwards trajectory, but that the lower arm reverses its course, and then it's almost like they're running parallel lines directly upwards, if that makes sense. And I guess it's the idea that in a free market economy, everybody gets richer just at different rates. And in a more socialist economy, everybody gets poorer at a fairly rapid rate. So what can the administration do to create that lower arm to reverse its course and start running parallel with the upper?
I mean, in the near term, probably not much. I mean, you see that, for example, there was the preliminary November University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index, and it showed
came out on Friday. Yes, of course. I didn't. No, I didn't.
It showed a divergence in expectations of the economy and current sentiment of the economy, and it showed once again that gap with a high people making more than $75,000. they were more optimistic about the economy and people earning, less than $75,000. But even in the stock market, you're not talking to us off air. You see the Magnificent Seven companies. This is Nvidia, this is Tesla, Amazon. Their earnings expectations have been revised upward continually over the past 12 months. But if you look at the rest of the stock market, they call it the S&P 493. Their earnings expectations have been revised lower. So in every part of the economy, you're seeing these warning signs of that gap. Companies are, what's funny too is that companies are responding to this as well. So for example, McDonald's, the CEO was on CNBC I think it was last month, and he said the reason why they expanded their value menu was because they noticed that lower income people were visiting their shops. Now, to be honest, I don't know how low income people can visit McDonald's these days considering the prices of everything, but that was the company's justification for its increase in the number of value menu options.
So what are people?
Or sorry, one more thing too. Sorry, Cox Automotive. It's an automotive platform and has the Kelly Blue Book, and that looks at automobile prices. And it said that the average price for a car crossed $50,000 for the first time ever. And one of the analysts said that the people who are buying the cars today are people in the upper income range. And when you look at all these numbers, it ties into everything you and I were discussing in the previous segments, like the Mamdani voters. It's young people who are not in that income trajectory right now. They get frustrated, and they're the ones who can't buy these homes or these cars or even visit the McDonald's to get that new vegan burger they have.
I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, Andrew. So what are people actually spending their income on, the ones on the lower arm? That they have some income, and is it staples? It's food, it's rent, and insurance, presumably, right?
Yes, absolutely. Utilities, but all these things, all these basics, they've just risen in price dramatically, and it's hard for them to keep up. And you cannot blame them for having such a negative view of the economy, despite some broader numbers suggesting that the U.S. economy is doing well and it is staying afloat.
I'm wondering if part of the solution is really just time, because people stay in a job and they presumably work their way up, and then as people get older, their income goes up. That's always been the big lie about the 1%ers, right?
But the problem, please.
Because a lot of people do make it into the 1% at some point in their careers. It's just that maybe they do it once they finally get that senior manager position in their 50s, and that's when they're financially stable. Whereas you've got a bunch of 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds thinking, well, I'm not financially stable. And the reality is, well, of course you're not. You're 24 years old. Why would you be?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, for a lot of left-leaning economists, they tend to think that income is static. So if you're making $100,000 a year, you will continually make that at the expense of everybody else. But if you really study the data over the years, you see a constant fluctuation of what everyone's making. One year I may make $30,000. The next year I may make $85,000 a year. But at the same time, I mean, again, it's always the two-handed economists, because if you look at, say, a private payroll processor, ADP, its national employment report, it showed that for people, the wage growth for job stayers is now the exact same as is for people who are job changers. And for a long time, you saw, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic, people who are changing jobs are earning a lot more than someone who stayed in the exact same position. I think the annual pay growth that ADP estimated was something like 4% year over year.
I'll leave us with the last words. I think it was the Count of Monte Cristo, and wait and hope. Andrew Moran, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that's just about all we have time for in this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guest today, Liberty Nation's economics editor, Mr. Andrew Moran, for taking the time to join us in this in-depth and fascinating conversation. And of course, thank you, the listeners at home. I hope you enjoyed the show, and we do appreciate you tuning in each and every week. You are appreciated. Please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation, and this presentation is no endorsement.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.